Hey guys, tonight we follow a girl who opens her mailbox and finds not just a letter, but a whole new dimension of reality. Picture this, a quiet Norwegian town, the hum of nature in the background, and Sophie Amundsen walking home from school. She's 15, inquisitive, and about to receive an anonymous envelope with a single question. Who are you? Just that. No signature, no explanation. And that's when the rabbit hole opens. You see, Sophie's world isn't just a novel. It's a time machine, a classroom, a dreamscape. And if you're here for deep questions, unexpected wonder, and philosophical bedtime stories, well, let's just say you probably won't survive this one unchanged. This book belongs in our Level 1 playlist, Awakening the Senses, where we start noticing the world around us and wondering what lies beneath its surface. Sophie's world captures that primal curiosity, like when we were children asking, why, until the grown-ups gave up. It's a story that reawakens that same sense of wonder, reminding us that philosophy isn't just for old men in togas. It's for every curious soul who's ever looked at the stars and felt very small and very alive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with a girl and a garden path. Sophie Amundsen, ordinary in every way, lives in a simple home on the outskirts of a Norwegian town. Her days are school and friends and errands, until one afternoon she receives that strange letter. Who are you? She's intrigued, of course. Who wouldn't be? The next day comes another letter. Where does the world come from? The questions multiply, as do Sophie's thoughts. The world she thought she knew begins to ripple. She finds a postcard meant for someone named Hilda, a girl she's never met. Mysterious, uneasy. Then, philosophy begins to arrive, not in a textbook, but in typed pages, sent by an invisible teacher who will become her guide. He's a philosopher named Alberto Knox, and he wants to teach Sophie everything. Their journey begins with mythology. Before science, before philosophy, people explain the world through stories. Giants, gods, thunder chariots. It wasn't foolishness. It was the first step. Humans needed stories to make sense of the unknown. But eventually, some thinkers dared to ask, is there another explanation? Sophie is captivated. She realizes that humans across time have tried to answer the same questions in different ways. What is real? What is truth? Where do we come from? Why are we here? We meet Thales, who believed everything came from water. Anaximander thought it came from the boundless. Heraclitus said it was fire and change. And Parmenides insisted nothing ever changed at all. The universe is argument. Reality is dialogue. Sophie begins to keep a notebook. She walks the garden and stares at the sky. She talks less to her schoolmates. Her mind is no longer in the world. It's above it, peering down like a child watching a snow globe. Alberto begins to guide her through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But first, he tells her this: always keep wondering. The moment you stop asking questions, the moment you stop being amazed by the world, you begin to fall asleep. And then comes the metaphor, the one we won't forget. Alberto compares life to a white rabbit pulled from a magician's top hat. Most people live deep down in the rabbit's fur, never realizing they're part of a miracle. Philosophers? They crawl up to the tips of the hairs, look around, and whisper, "What is this?" Sophie? She's crawling higher every day. But what's curious is how personal this becomes. Who is Hilda? Why is Sophie receiving cards meant for her? Is someone watching? Controlling? Or is Sophie fictional? Don't worry. The deeper unraveling is still to come. For now, Sophie's philosophical journey begins like all of ours did, with awe. And from here, we begin to see the world with her eyes. The lessons continue. As Sophie dives deeper into the history of Western philosophy, the world around her begins to feel like part of the lesson. A quiet town transformed into a stage for ancient thought. After myths and pre-Socratic thinkers, Alberto introduces her to Socrates, the barefoot troublemaker of Athens. Socrates, who asked so many questions they eventually killed him for it. His famous method, asking questions not to trap, but to reveal truth, fascinates Sophie. And it fascinates us too, because it feels like something we know deep down. Truth isn't always handed to us. Sometimes we uncover it one brave question at a time. Socrates taught us that wisdom begins in admitting our ignorance. He didn't write anything down. We know him through Plato, his student, who wrote dialogues with Socrates as the hero, though always a reluctant one. Sophie reads Plato's allegory of the cave, and the world tilts again. People living in a cave, watching shadows on a wall, thinking that's all there is. One person escapes, sees the sun, and realizes there's more. But when he returns, the others don't believe him. The image burns in her mind. What if we're all living in that cave? And as Sophie takes these ideas in, she finds herself changing. The things that used to interest her, TV, gossip, homework, feel distant now. She walks differently, thinks differently. She's becoming someone new. Then the Renaissance arrives in her lessons. Alberto walks her through 1,000 years of thought, from the rise of Christianity and Augustine's melding of Greek thought with Christian theology, to Aquinas, who tried to harmonize reason and faith. It's here Sophie senses a struggle between the divine and the rational, between blind belief and thoughtful inquiry. She learns of Descartes, the man who doubted everything until he found one undeniable truth. I think, therefore I am. That phrase strikes Sophie like a bell. It's simple, elegant, unshakable. From there, we meet Spinoza, who saw God not as an old man in the sky, but as the very fabric of the universe. God as nature. And Locke, who argued that the mind is a blank slate, tabula rasa, at birth shaped by experience. Sophie realizes how revolutionary this was. It means we are not born knowing. We are made by the world around us. Alberto then takes her to Hume, the Scottish skeptic. Hume doubted everything, even causality. Just because the sun rises every day doesn't mean it must rise tomorrow. We assume patterns, but we can't prove them. Hume questions whether we can ever know anything with certainty. And then Berkeley, who claimed the world only exists because God perceives it. To be is to be perceived. Sophie finds this idea dizzying. If no one's looking, does the tree disappear? Each philosopher becomes a stepping stone, and Sophie walks across centuries of thought. But she also begins noticing something strange. Alberto seems too involved. The letters from Hilda keep appearing, and Sophie begins to suspect that she, herself, may not be real. There's a moment, a beautiful, unsettling one, when she finds a mirror. She looks into it and wonders, who is reflecting whom? But for now, we stay grounded in the ideas. Next comes Kant, the gentle colossus of German philosophy. He argued that we never see the world as it is, only as it appears to us. Our minds shape reality, space and time, not out there, but part of how we perceive. We are not passive receivers. We're active creators of the world we experience. That changes everything. And now, Sophie feels like she's no longer reading philosophy. She's living it. The world is alive with ideas. Sophie feels the pull of ideas curling in her every thought, every breath. What started as curiosity has now turned into a quiet transformation. With each philosopher she meets through Alberto's letters, her world becomes richer, more layered, less certain, but somehow more real. Now she turns to Romanticism, that deeply emotional rebellion against cold Enlightenment rationality, where the philosophers of reason praised clarity and science. The Romantics burst forth with feelings, intuition, and nature's raw beauty. It's in this era Sophie sees the human soul spilling into poetry and painting. Rousseau, Goethe, Schelling, they all believed in the inner voice and the wildness of the spirit. Sophie reads that Rousseau claimed humans are born free, but everywhere they are in chains. He believed society corrupts the purity we're born with. And for the first time, Sophie starts seeing how much of what we do is shaped not by truth, but by expectation. Who tells us what's normal, what's beautiful, what's right? Then she dives into Hegel, a towering mind who claimed that truth unfolds through contradiction. The world isn't static. It moves through a dialectic process. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Opposing forces collide and evolve. This idea resonates deeply. Sophie realizes that maybe confusion and chaos aren't the enemies of truth. They're the birthing grounds of it. And then something happens. The philosophy lessons start bleeding into Sophie's life in surreal ways. She finds strange postcards addressed to someone else. Hilda, tucked into Alberto's envelopes. Hilda's father, it seems, is a major somewhere far away. But how are these letters ending up in Sophie's mailbox? Why does the name Hilda keep echoing through her reality? The questions keep piling up like mist. In the midst of this confusion, Alberto brings her to Marx. This is a sharp pivot from dreamy romantics and abstract metaphysics. Marx believed that ideas weren't born in isolation. They were shaped by material conditions. Economic structures mold consciousness. The base determines the superstructure. Sophie begins to notice the world differently. She sees the inequalities around her with clearer eyes, the invisible hands that guide society. Marx said religion was the opiate of the masses, but Sophie wonders, what else are we numbing ourselves with? Then comes Darwin, the man who shattered the static view of life. Evolution, natural selection, no grand design, just adaptation over time. The impact on Sophie is profound. She sees the deep time behind every living thing. She realizes the human story is part of something vaster, messier, and more wondrous than we ever imagined. And then Freud steps into the scene, ushering in the age of the unconscious. The iceberg metaphor hits hard. Most of who we are, Freud argued, lies beneath the surface. Desires, fears, traumas, all hidden but shaping us. Sophie starts questioning her own dreams, her impulses. What's lurking beneath? Her philosophical journey is now deeply personal. Meanwhile, the mystery of Hilda intensifies. Sophie finds more postcards meant for this other girl, and increasingly, her world starts to feel scripted. She finds her own name in a book. She reads a story about herself. She's being watched, or worse, written. But before that question overwhelms, Alberto introduces her to existentialism. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, these aren't thinkers offering neat blueprints. They ask the terrifying, liberating question, what does it mean to exist? Kierkegaard urges us to leap, to live passionately despite uncertainty. Nietzsche declares God is dead, not in celebration, but in mourning. If God is dead, he says, we must become our own creators. Sophie feels the fire of that idea. And then Sartre, no essence before existence. We're not born with purpose, we choose it. That freedom is exhilarating and paralyzing. Sophie's head swims. If nothing defines her but her choices, then she must confront her own life, her own identity. Who is she really? But how can she choose when she's not even sure she's real? That question only intensifies as Alberto reveals something staggering. They're part of a book, a story written by Hilda's father. Sophie and Alberto are characters. Fictional. But what does it mean to be fictional? Are we not all shaped by stories, by scripts written before we even understand the lines? The lines between reality and illusion blur. Sophie and Alberto plan to rebel against their author, to become free. Sophie's philosophical journey has become a meta-journey. A girl studying philosophy within a story that itself teaches philosophy. A tale folding in on itself. And yet, instead of feeling trapped, Sophie feels alive. Because if her world is a fiction, then so is ours, in a way. We are born into roles, into cultures, into inherited truths. Philosophy is the only way out, the only way to see the structure and maybe, just maybe, reshape it. The storm of Sophie's awakening continues, and now, reality seems thinner than paper. Every glance, every word, holds the possibility of being authored, not by fate or gods, but by a man named Albert Nag, somewhere far away, writing a story for his daughter, Hilda. But instead of despair, Sophie feels a growing power. If she can be written, then she can resist the pen. Alberto confirms the surreal truth. He too knows now that he's a character, a construct inside someone else's narrative. He tells Sophie that everything, her school, her mother, her dog, exists within the imagination of a man playing with philosophy as bedtime literature for his daughter. It's an existential gut punch, and it leads Sophie to the final steps of her philosophical education, existence itself. Now, it's not just a topic, it's personal. She's no longer reading philosophy. She's living its hardest questions. She and Alberto aren't just discussing freedom. They're staging a revolt inside of fiction. But first, they return to Heidegger, the master of being. Heidegger doesn't care about categories or systems. He wants us to confront the raw fact that we are being thrown into the world and left to make sense of it. Sophie starts to see every moment, even her confusion, as part of the pulse of being alive. Then comes Sartre, returning with even sharper edges. Man is condemned to be free, he says. There is no script, no divine director, only the actor on stage, writing the lines as they speak them. And the worst part? You can't not act. Even in refusing to choose, you've made a choice. Responsibility is total. Now, Sophie feels the weight of it, the weight of being human, the terrifying beauty of it. She begins to reject passivity. She begins to ask, how do I act with authenticity, even if I was created? And Alberto smiles. That's the question. Sophie and Alberto hatch a plan, a metaphysical jailbreak. They decide to confront their author by disrupting the story, behaving unpredictably, refusing to follow the narrative logic. If they're just words on a page, there will be disobedient ones. Their rebellion is a mirror of philosophy itself. At its heart, philosophy is a revolt, a refusal to accept things as given. It is the art of asking, but why? And then asking again. They throw a party. Not just any party, but an absurd, chaotic, logic-breaking celebration where ancient philosophers, fairy tale creatures, and fictional beings mingle in defiance of genre, theme, and coherence. The story breaks. Logic bends, and suddenly they slip through. It's ambiguous how. It always is with revolutions. But Sophie and Alberto escape the confines of the written story. They exist now in a liminal space, still fictional, still ghost-like, but free of narrative control. Watching, listening, aware. Meanwhile, the book folds into itself. We meet Hilda, the daughter, the real one, the reader. She begins to question her father's manipulation. She empathizes with Sophie. She sees the characters not as toys, but as beings with interiority. She too awakens. It's a brilliant twist. The reader of the book, us, are watching Hilda, who is reading Sophie, who is learning philosophy. 3 mirrors, 1,000 reflections, and all asking the same thing. What is real? As Hilda rebels against her father's narrative games, the final lesson lands like a soft whisper. We are all inside stories. We are written by biology, by culture, by language. But awareness, self-awareness, is the first crack in the shell. Philosophy is not a subject. It's a toolbox. It's the lamp you hold in a dark forest. It doesn't banish the night, but it helps you walk through it. Sophie, no longer just a curious girl, becomes a symbol, a stand-in for every person who's ever sat quietly and asked, "Why am I here?" The book ends without firm answers. Of course it does, but it leaves you with a question bigger than any conclusion. If Sophie can awaken inside a story, can we? If Sophie can rebel against a script, can we? And then you remember being a child, lying in bed, looking at the ceiling, asking questions no adult ever answered properly. Where did I come from? What happens after death? Why is there suffering? This book doesn't answer them. It honors them. It reminds you that the asking is the awakening, that questions are more powerful than answers, and that even if we are part of a story, we can still wonder, still choose, still search. The tale of Sophie's world ends not with a bang, but with a whisper and an invitation. Philosophy doesn't solve your life. It teaches you how to live it. As the echoes of Sophie's awakening settle, we are left wandering with her in that ghostly in-between space. She and Alberto now exist beyond the narrative, observers more than participants, yet still touched by everything they've learned. The philosophical education continues, not in the classroom, but in the quiet contemplation of what it means to be aware. This is where the summary slowly gives way to the second half of our journey, review and analysis. And Sophie's world offers much to reflect on. First, the structure of the novel is astonishing in its ambition. Gaarder has nested realities like a Russian doll, wrapping a straightforward coming-of-age story inside a survey of Western philosophy, then encasing both in a metafictional commentary on narrative, reality, and authorship. It's layered without being pretentious, complex without being cold. At the heart of this design is a childlike wonder that never fades. Even as the story grows heavier with concepts, from Democritus to Hume, Descartes to Kierkegaard, it maintains a tone of curiosity. Sophie is never an expert. She is always learning. And that is the soul of Level 1, awakening the senses. Because at this stage, we don't need absolute truths. We need awe. We need questions. We need to sit with ideas like they're warm tea on a rainy morning. Gaarder gives us that. He doesn't preach. He invites. And that's why this novel is so effective for young readers or anyone beginning their philosophical journey. It doesn't ask you to agree with Plato or Nietzsche. It just wants you to know they existed and that they ask the same questions that bubble up in your chest when you're lying awake at 3 a.m. The characters reflect this journey. Sophie isn't perfect. She's moody, confused, restless, but that makes her real. Her reactions are authentic. She isn't reading philosophy the way students read textbooks. She's feeling it, absorbing it into her reality, letting it reshape the world around her. That's what Level 1 is about, absorbing impressions, letting the ideas rain down, not yet analyzing them, but being changed nonetheless. And Alberto, he's more than a teacher. He's a kind of guide through the metaphysical wilderness. He represents what all good educators should be, not answer machines, but spark makers. He gives Sophie the tools, then steps aside. That restraint is powerful. Then there's Hilda and her father, mirroring the tension between creation and control. Their relationship is strange, sweet, and chilling all at once. As Hilda begins to question the ethics of storytelling, of creating sentient characters only to watch them suffer, we're asked to reflect on our power. As readers, as storytellers, as thinkers, it leads to a question that lingers long after the book ends. Are we the authors of our lives or the characters? The novel doesn't answer, but it suggests the power of self-awareness. Just as Sophie becomes aware of her fictional nature, we can become aware of the system shaping us. Our upbringing, our culture, our unconscious habits. That awareness doesn't guarantee escape, but it opens the door. In literary terms, Gaarder achieves something rare. He uses narrative to simulate a philosophical experience. The reader undergoes an education just as Sophie does. We start confused. We resist. We grow curious. We feel frustration, then awe, then maybe clarity. The pacing reflects this, too. The early chapters are short, almost childlike. As Sophie matures, so do the pages. Sentences stretch. Ideas deepen. The tone shifts from playful to contemplative. It's a subtle transformation, but effective. Like aging in real life, sudden only in hindsight. Stylistically, Gaarder is gentle. He rarely overwhelms. He doesn't bury the reader in academic jargon. His prose is soft, like a parent explaining stars to a child. Even complex ideas, Spinoza's pantheism, Kant's categories of understanding, are filtered through metaphors and stories. This isn't philosophy for scholars. It's philosophy for the soul, and it's timely. In a world flooded with opinions, certainty, and endless noise, Sophie's world is a quiet space to ask questions without shame, to admit we don't know, to marvel, to sit with the uncomfortable beauty of not having answers. That is deeply human. Now, let's talk about the philosophical heart of the book. There's a through line in Sophie's education. What does it mean to exist? And it's no accident that this question arises at the intersection of fiction and reality. By making Sophie a character who becomes aware of her own unreality, Gaarder forces us to confront the constructed nature of our own lives. Are we born into a script? Are we following roles, expectations, societal narratives? If we are, then philosophy becomes the act of rewriting. It becomes rebellion. It becomes freedom, but not the loud, cinematic kind. The freedom Sophie discovers is quiet. It's the freedom to ask, to doubt, to wonder. It is the first glimmer of selfhood, the first breath of independent thought. And that's why this book belongs in level 1 of our playlist. It's not about mastery. It's about awakening. It's about those first stirrings of consciousness, like a baby discovering its own hands. Sophie's world is not just a book. It's a mirror. You don't finish it with answers. You finish it looking inward, asking your own questions. and somewhere, maybe smiling, because you've joined a tradition older than any religion, older than any empire, the tradition of wonder. Sophie is not alone in her journey, and neither are we. The deeper we venture into Gaarder's layered world, the more we realize this book isn't just about philosophy. It is philosophy embodied, not in the form of dense theories or footnoted pages, but as a living experience, the kind you carry with you long after the story ends. Let's step even closer to the symbolic core. Think back to the mirror. Sophie peers into it, first literally, then figuratively. At first, it's just a reflection. Then it becomes an existential metaphor. As she begins to understand her fictional nature, she also starts seeing herself as distinct from her surroundings, from her mother, her school, even the house she thought was home. This detachment is frightening at first, but it's also essential. Why? Because awakening always begins with a fracture. To become aware, something must break. The illusion of permanence, of familiarity. Sophie's normal life must fall apart to allow something deeper to emerge. This is the path every conscious being takes, a shattering followed by searching. And Gaarder orchestrates that transition with care. He doesn't shock the reader. He nudges, gently, persistently. This makes Sophie's world a particularly poignant entry in the Level 1 playlist. Remember, this level isn't about heroic transformation or grand revelations. It's about those quiet shifts in perception. The moment a child realizes adults don't know everything. The moment you recognize your own fear. The moment you question a belief you've held since childhood. Sophie lives all of those. Now let's talk about the thematic arcs woven through the novel. There are three major ones that deserve attention. 1. The journey from innocence to awareness. This is the classic arc of coming of age. But in Sophie's world, it's metaphysical. Sophie doesn't just mature emotionally. She matures ontologically. She goes from being a passive observer of her life to an active participant in the universe's structure. That's not just a character arc. It's a spiritual initiation. It reminds us that growth isn't just about age or experience. It's about perception. The world doesn't change. You do. 2. The nature of free will. As Sophie learns, she's a fictional creation. The question of autonomy becomes central. Can she make choices? Does she have control? This mirrors the human condition. Are we the sum of our programming, biology, culture, upbringing? Or was there something deeper? A spark? Gaarder doesn't preach. He lets Sophie's struggle unfold naturally. And through her, we reflect on our own illusions of control. 3. The search for meaning. Philosophy, at its heart, is a response to mortality. Sophie is too young to fear death, but she does fear insignificance. That fear drives her curiosity. Why are we here? What matters? Through ancient and modern thinkers, she confronts the void, and instead of despairing, she grows curious. That's the magic of the novel. It doesn't promise answers. It promises the right questions. Stylistically, Gaarder uses time and season to underscore Sophie's evolution. We begin in spring, a symbol of birth. As her lessons deepen, summer takes over, mirroring a blooming intellect. And though the book doesn't end in literal winter, there's a kind of philosophical autumn in its final chapters, a quiet maturity, a letting go. His language adapts, too. Early on, the tone is playful, inquisitive. As Sophie's awareness sharpens, the language becomes richer, denser. There's more reflection, fewer exclamations. It's as though we're watching a child grow up in real time, not just in behavior, but in thought. The use of letters and notebooks as vehicles for learning is another elegant touch. They create a tactile intimacy. Reading them feels private, like stumbling upon someone else's journal. That intimacy draws us closer to Sophie's mind. We're not just observing her thoughts. We're inside them. Now, let's address the philosophers themselves. Sophie's world functions as a kind of primer, a chronological journey through Western philosophy, from Thales and the pre-Socratics to Marx and Darwin. Each thinker is introduced in digestible segments. Gaarder doesn't just summarize theories. He dramatizes them. We see how ideas emerge from context, from geography, politics, religion. It's a reminder that philosophy isn't abstract. It's rooted in life, in conflict, in hunger and war and wonder. Some might criticize this as simplistic, but simplicity is not the enemy of depth. In fact, it's often the doorway. By stripping these ideas down to their essence, Gaarder makes them accessible. He shows us that you don't need a degree to think deeply. You just need curiosity, and Sophie has that in abundance. The result? A kind of mental awakening that mirrors what happens when children first discover language. Suddenly, there's a tool for everything. Sadness, wonder, injustice. Gaarder gives readers that same toolbox, but for the mind. We'd be remiss not to mention the meta-narrative twist, where Sophie and Alberto recognize they are part of a story written by Albert Nag. This isn't just a clever device. It's a philosophical statement. The moment you realize you're in a story, you become something new. You become the reader of your own life. And that is the beginning of all wisdom. This twist echoes Descartes' cogito ergo sum, but in a modern key. Sophie doesn't just think, she questions the nature of her thinking. She doubts the context. She sees the seams. And so, she begins to wake up, just like us. Gaarder's gift is that he allows us to walk beside her, to feel the same disorientation, the same exhilaration. He doesn't explain philosophy. He performs it in every page, in every doubt. And by the end of this journey, you're not just someone who has read about Aristotle or Hegel. You're someone who has started to wonder. And that, dear listener, is how all true philosophy begins. The story continues, but the reality is beginning to crumble. Sophie and Alberto are now fully aware of their predicament, that they are mere characters in a book being written by someone else. Their world is no longer just mysterious. It is unstable. The seams of a narrative are showing, and Sophie is beginning to feel what it means to exist not in the real world, but in someone's idea of it. This might sound like a simple metafictional gimmick, but remember, this book belongs in level 1, awakening the senses. And what greater sensory shock is there than discovering that your world is scripted, your actions observed, and your thoughts constructed? Sophie and Alberto's philosophical discussions now take on a double function. Not only do they continue introducing us to thinkers, Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, but they begin using these very philosophies to analyze their situation. Are they truly self-aware if they're fictional? Does consciousness depend on existence, or is awareness enough? Hegel's dialectics, for example, become more than just abstract theory. The thesis of Sophie's normal life meets the antithesis, her awareness of fiction. The synthesis? A new form of being, a being that questions its creator, a being that dares to escape. And that's exactly what Sophie and Alberto begin planning. Their philosophical journey becomes a literal rebellion. A rebellion against the author, against the creator, against the confines of the text. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The elegance of Gaarder's storytelling is in how gradually this transformation unfolds. It's not a sudden war cry. It's a creeping feeling, like waking from a dream that was too coherent to be real. During this phase, we're introduced to key figures of modern philosophy, and they serve as perfect metaphors for Sophie's growing self-awareness. Kant, with his ideas about the synthetic a priori and the limits of reason, speaks to the limits of Sophie's world. She begins to understand that she cannot access the thing in itself, the true reality, only the representation given to her. Sound familiar? It's her existence as a character made painfully clear. Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, offers Sophie her first glimpse into personal truth. His leap of faith and his focus on subjective experience resonate with Sophie's growing belief that even if she is fictional, her experience still matters. This, in turn, fuels her resolve to take action, to do something, even if it's just for the sake of doing it. Hegel's idea of history as the unfolding of spirit, that everything is interconnected and developing toward freedom, becomes the backdrop for Sophie and Alberto's decision to act. They're no longer just characters reading about freedom. They're trying to live it within the limits of fiction. But what does freedom look like when your world is a story? Well, for Sophie and Alberto, it means destabilizing the story itself. They begin to do things the author wouldn't expect, skipping scenes, breaking routines, speaking directly to the reader, questioning the logic of the world around them. These subtle acts of defiance are, in themselves, deeply philosophical. Because what is philosophy if not the refusal to take the world at face value? All of this occurs while Sophie's philosophical education continues, like a schoolgirl carrying her books through a war zone. There's something surreal and touching about it. She still studies, still thinks, still learns, even as the world unravels. This dual narrative structure, lessons in philosophy and existential escape, mirrors our own journey as readers. We start with curiosity, then confusion, then clarity, and finally, a sense of agency. Sophie's fictional awakening nudges us toward our own. And in that, Gaarder achieves something rare. He writes a novel that teaches you how to be conscious. Now, let's explore the symbolic imagery that intensifies in this phase of the novel. One of the most striking metaphors is the garden. It's no accident that many of Sophie's discoveries happen in her backyard. The garden becomes a symbol of controlled nature, something that appears free but is actually fenced in. Just like her life, just like ours, sometimes. As she starts to question the garden, question the edges, she's really questioning the shape of her reality, the borders of her being. Then there's the mirror again, but now it reflects differently. Sophie no longer sees just herself. She sees the possibility of seeing more. She begins to suspect there's something beyond the mirror, beyond the world Albert Nag created, and she wants to reach it. There's also the recurring image of puppets, a subtle nod to Plato's cave. Characters who move but don't know who pulls the strings. It's a haunting thought, isn't it? But Sophie doesn't just want to see the puppeteer. She wants to cut the strings. This rebellion is not violent. It's intellectual, spiritual, imaginative, and that's what makes it so compelling. Gaarder isn't writing a thriller. He's staging a thought experiment. What happens when a thinking being becomes aware of its fictionality? What happens when the creation confronts the creator? And here's where the magic of the book deepens. It starts echoing your own life. You may not be fictional, but have you ever wondered how much of your life is scripted? How many of your choices are really yours? How much of your identity was written by others? Parents, teachers, media? Sophie's escape becomes your metaphor. Her awakening, your invitation. And as the chapter closes, we begin to sense that something irreversible is happening. Sophie isn't just waking up. She's stepping beyond. She's preparing to cross a line that few characters and even fewer people ever do. From passive to active, from dream to dreamer, from question to questioner. The boundary is near, and Sophie is ready to cross it. Are you? The world around Sophie and Alberto continues to dissolve like mist at sunrise. Their rebellion against their fictional nature isn't loud or violent, but rather elegant, patient, philosophical, and that somehow makes it more powerful. Every quiet moment between them becomes charged with meaning. Every lesson is a spark, illuminating the hidden machinery of their world. Sophie, once just a curious schoolgirl, now walks through her reality with suspicion and awareness. It's as though every blade of grass whispers that it's been placed there by someone else. She no longer accepts things as given. And if you've ever had that moment where the world suddenly feels constructed less natural than you thought, then you know exactly what she's going through. Tonight, we follow Sophie and Alberto as they begin planning their escape. Yes, escape. Not just from school or home or even from society, but from the very story they're trapped in. Their lessons in philosophy have equipped them not with weapons, but with clarity. The kind of clarity that lets you see the cracks in the wall. And once you see the cracks, you start to wonder what's on the other side. Alberto, ever the guide, ever the teacher, begins to shift. He's no longer just explaining ideas. He's applying them. And we, along with Sophie, see just how powerful thought can be. They revisit the lessons from earlier thinkers, not to memorize them, but to use them. From Descartes, they draw the idea of doubt as a tool. I think, therefore I am, becomes a spell of power in this fictional world. Sophie, by doubting her existence, paradoxically proves her own consciousness, even if that consciousness is ink on a page. From Hume, they recall the limitations of causality. Nothing is necessarily as it appears. Just because the sun rose yesterday doesn't mean it must rise tomorrow. Or in Sophie's case, just because her world behaves like reality doesn't mean it is real. This idea becomes central to their escape, because to break out of a fictional universe, you first have to stop believing in its rules. And so they begin to test the system. Time skips. Clocks run backward. Events repeat themselves in strange ways. People around them behave like broken automatons. Sophie starts saying things the author didn't intend, things that break the logic of the world. At first, it's terrifying. Then it's empowering. They also begin to theorize about Albert Nag, the father of Hilda, the man writing their story. They suspect he is creating this world as a gift for his daughter. But Sophie doesn't want to be anyone's gift. She wants to be free. So they plan a grand disruption. They will sabotage the party Albert Nag has planned in the book. A party meant to celebrate Hilda's birthday. Sophie and Alberto, characters who were supposed to vanish after serving their purpose, intend to take center stage. The metaphor here is not subtle, but it's beautiful. Sophie refuses to be a side character in someone else's story, and in that, she becomes deeply human. But perhaps the most potent influence at this point is Freud. As Alberto teaches Sophie about the unconscious, the buried motives, the childhood wounds, the hidden fears, Sophie begins to wonder. If she has a subconscious, is she not real in some essential way? Isn't dreaming proof of depth? This is where the novel becomes something more than a story. It becomes a mirror, because maybe we're all a little like Sophie, dreaming our way through someone else's script, performing for an invisible audience, following rules we never agreed to. And maybe, just maybe, we all have the power to disrupt the narrative. That's what Sophie and Alberto set out to do. They refuse to fade. They refuse to be controlled. And they prepare to crash the party. It's not just a party in the story. It's a celebration of the story. A victory lap for Albert Nag. A moment where he expects everything to go as planned. But Sophie has learned too much. She has read The Republic. She has questioned the cave. And she's ready to break the chains. The build-up to this moment is rich with symbols. There's the book within the book motif. Sophie reads about herself. She reads about Hilda. Hilda, in turn, reads about Sophie. The boundaries collapse. Reader becomes character. Character becomes reader. And somewhere in the middle is the truth Gaarder wants us to find. That philosophy isn't abstract. It's urgent. That thinking isn't passive. It's revolutionary. And that waking up, truly waking up, is terrifying. But it's worth it. As they near the end of the chapter, Sophie and Alberto step closer to freedom. Not literal freedom, but the freedom to act, to question, to choose. They have embraced their roles not as puppets, but as philosophers. And that is where real change begins. In a whisper, in a question, in the decision to say, I see this story, but I don't believe in it. And so they prepare to step off the page, not just as characters, but as ideas, as dreams. The sun never quite sets in Sophie's world, not in the usual way. Time flickers, looping back on itself like a reel being rewound, fast-forwarded, and scratched over by an unseen hand. And in that surreal dance of daylight, Sophie and Alberto arrive at the climax of their rebellion. The party is approaching. The moment that Albert Nag, the omnipotent puppet master and philosopher dad, has been riding toward. His daughter Hilda's birthday celebration is scripted to be the grand convergence, the moment when the book within the book aligns neatly with reality. But Sophie? She's not in the mood for choreography. Not anymore. She and Alberto step outside the narrative, almost literally. Their words begin to veer off script. Conversations become unscripted, loose, improvisational. Alberto comments on plot holes. Sophie throws winks at the reader, as though she knows you're there, sitting in your bed or leaning on your pillow, listening. And the world doesn't collapse. It shivers. This is philosophy at work, not as an abstract pastime, but as an existential crowbar. Sophie has now absorbed lessons from existentialists like Kierkegaard, who insisted that truth is subjective and that the self must leap into faith or authenticity. She understands Sartre's nausea, Camus' absurdity, Nietzsche's will to power, even if she hasn't studied their names yet. She feels them because she is living a version of their questions. Who am I if my choices are pre-written? What is freedom when everything is orchestrated? And what's the point of reason if I cannot choose? In a particularly striking moment, Sophie begins to manipulate the world around her, slightly at first. She moves objects without explanation. She interrupts conversations that haven't started yet. The laws of her universe weaken as her philosophical courage strengthens. Alberto, ever the mentor, smiles quietly. His job, he realizes, may soon be done. Meanwhile, the book shifts focus, blurring more and more between Sophie's world and Hilda's. Hilda has grown increasingly enchanted by Sophie. She begins to wonder if Sophie might have a will of her own. Her father's manuscript, once amusing and clever, now feels dangerous. It's no longer a simple birthday gift. It's become a moral experiment. Can one create life, consciousness, even in fiction? And if you do you have a right to control it? Hilda starts leaving notes inside her father's manuscript, writing back, like inserting hidden messages inside a dream. And somehow, Sophie receives them. This exchange across realities is what makes Sophie's world so haunting. It's a recursive loop of observer and observed, author and character, mind and matter. And in its eerie unfolding, it quietly reveals something we all sense deep down, that we too might be characters in someone else's script, that our decisions might not be entirely our own. The party scene arrives. It's both absurd and tense. Guests arrive. Candles flicker. Music plays. And Sophie walks through the scene like a ghost who's just remembered she's dead. Everything feels off. Conversations repeat themselves. Guests turn to her in slow motion, their smiles mechanical, their eyes blank. Then Sophie speaks, and the world hiccups. She declares her existence, not as a fictional puppet, but as a real consciousness. She questions everything. She demands answers. And just like that, the fragile reality around her starts to crumble. Not violently, not with explosions, but like a stage being dismantled plank by plank. Alberto joins her, explaining to the party guests that they are fictional, that their entire world exists only as a story for Hilda. He even names their author, Albert Nag, and explains the birthday gift plan. The guests stare blankly, or glitch slightly, or disappear entirely. It's funny. It's terrifying. It's deeply philosophical. Because what is freedom if no one else believes in it? Hilda, meanwhile, reads all this in stunned silence. She watches Sophie declare her personhood, watches her reject the narrative. And for the first time, Hilda becomes uncomfortable. Not guilty, exactly, but responsible. As though her imagination may have summoned this world into being. As though she may be a co-creator with her father. Here, Gaarder nudges us toward metaphysics. The idea that consciousness might emerge not from biology alone, but from story. That a mind, sufficiently complex, becomes real whether it's made of neurons or of ink. Sophie and Alberto escape during the party. It's a beautifully absurd scene. They slip into a hedge, vanish behind trees, and the world doesn't stop them. No divine hand appears. Non era ter intervenes. They walk off the page, quite literally, and we are left wondering, did they just become real? Of course, the novel doesn't answer that question. Not directly, because this isn't a story about what is real, but about how we decide what matters. Sophie and Alberto disappear into a kind of philosophical twilight, neither dead nor alive, neither real nor fictional, but free. Hilda, moved by what she's read, confronts her father. And here's where things get uncomfortably human. Because Albert Nag, the philosopher, the trickster, the author, doesn't apologize. He defends his choices, explains his intentions, and makes clear that he enjoyed playing God just a little. That writing Sophie's life gave him a strange kind of power. And that maybe, just maybe, that's something all creators wrestle with. Hilda pushes back. She doesn't get angry, but she questions him gently, persistently. And for the first time, Nag listens. Their conversation reflects a larger dialogue between creator and creation, between parent and child, between logic and ethics. It's about responsibility, about what it means to breathe life into a world, and then to respect the lives within it. As this conversation unfolds, Gaarder circles back to his earliest themes. Wonder, curiosity, the astonishing fact that we are here at all. Sophie's world doesn't end with answers. It ends with awareness. And that, perhaps, is the point. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a story can do isn't to explain the world. It's to make you question it, to shake you awake, to whisper in your ear as you drift towards sleep. What if none of this is real? And more importantly, what if it is? We drift now into the quieter, more contemplative spaces of Sophie's world, a time after the dramatic escape, when the dust has settled but the mind is still reeling. Sophie and Alberto, our rebels turned philosophers on the run, have left the artificial stage of the birthday party behind. What remains is a surreal, almost meditative journey through philosophical reflection. They're no longer merely within the pages of a story, or at least they behave as though they're not. Sophie begins to experience the world differently. Every breeze feels intentional, every leaf a whisper from a universe trying to understand itself. She doesn't speak much, but her silences are heavy with awareness. She's absorbing, contemplating, becoming. This phase of the story is almost dreamlike. A philosophical slow-motion montage. They wander through forests, sit beside rivers, watch the stars, and muse aloud. Not as teacher and student now, but as co-thinkers, co-dreamers. They reflect on the mind-body problem, on dualism versus monism, and what it means to be conscious in a potentially illusory world. Are they minds without bodies? Are they figments with feelings? Alberto explains solipsism, the idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. A concept both liberating and terrifying. Sophie listens but doesn't wholly accept it. She feels real, and her feelings, she decides, are data points. They mean something. Alberto explains solipsism, the idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. A concept both liberating and terrifying. Sophie listens but doesn't wholly accept it. She feels real, and her feelings, she decides, are data points. They mean something. It's during this wandering that the narrative structure loosens even further. We start getting echoes of voices, Hilda's thoughts, Nag's scribblings, bits of reality bleeding into fiction. There's a recurring sound Sophie hears, a faint rustling like pages being turned. It's subtle, poetic, but also chilling. Someone is still reading, watching, writing. Hilda becomes more involved now. Having finished the manuscript her father left for her, she continues the story in her imagination. And because Sophie's world plays by metaphysical rules, her imagination matters. What Hilda believes, what she feels, begins to influence Sophie's reality. And this is where Gaarder's genius shines. We're no longer just reading about a girl learning philosophy. We are within a live experiment in metafiction. The narrative suggests that ideas, pure ideas, can shape worlds. That thought is a form of creation, and that to imagine someone deeply enough is to love them into being. Hilda starts asking questions too, not just about philosophy, but about ethics, about the morality of creating conscious life. She begins journaling about free will, quoting Kant, paraphrasing Hume, wrestling with the implications of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. She wonders aloud whether Sophie might truly be. And in that wondering, she becomes a philosopher herself. So what are we witnessing here? A collapse of boundaries between fiction and reality, between student and teacher, between character and creator. Sophie and Hilda begin to reflect each other. They're not identical, but symbiotic. Hilda gives Sophie voice. Sophie gives Hilda courage. Through Sophie's philosophical awakening, Hilda comes of age. Meanwhile, back in the fictional real world, Alberto and Sophie are trying to push even further beyond the edge of their constructed reality. They speak less often, They pause more. They stare at sunsets with suspicion, trying to see the brush strokes behind the clouds. There's a beautiful moment when Sophie tries to taste rain. She closes her eyes, opens her mouth, and whispers, "Is this water real?" Then laughs, not because the question is silly, but because it's no longer frightening. That's what's changed. Early in the story, the unknown scared her. Now it invites her. This is the heart of philosophical maturation. The shift from seeking answers to falling in love with the questions themselves. Gaarder begins weaving in echoes from earlier philosophers. Heraclitus River, Plato's Cave, Descartes' Doubt. They echo now not as abstract teachings, but as living metaphors. Sophie begins to dream of firelight flickering on cave walls, of shadows dancing and whispering. This isn't the real world. She wakes smiling. You know you've crossed a threshold when illusions comfort you more than certainties. And what of Hilda's father, Albert Nag? He becomes quieter in the background. He's still writing somewhere, still guiding, but his presence is fading. Perhaps even he is rethinking what it means to be an author, a creator. His experiment has grown beyond him. Sophie is no longer his gift to Hilda. She is her own person now, if personhood can be extended to story beings. His role becomes almost mythic. The distant god who has withdrawn to let his creation flourish or fail on its own. It's here that Sophie's world begins its philosophical cool-down. Not a resolution, exactly, but a soft slowing of the intellectual heartbeat. Gaarder doesn't aim for narrative closure. He knows that wouldn't suit a book about philosophy. What he wants instead is an open ending, an infinite ellipsis. Now, in this shifting space where stories bleed into minds and minds bend the shape of stories, we follow Sophie and Alberto into their most uncertain terrain yet, a realm of abstraction where ideas become atmospheres. They no longer chase freedom from a plot. They seek freedom from limitation itself. But limitation, their learning, often wears the mask of logic. The air is thinner here. Gaarder's narrative becomes whispery, spectral. Sophie and Alberto start to reflect on the meaning of freedom. Not just freedom from Albert Nag's pen, but freedom from any system. From history, from belief, from identity. Sophie sits by a stream and wonders, if I am only thought, can I change my essence by thinking differently? Alberto nod solemnly. Perhaps, he says, but even the freest thought is shaped by the thinker. They begin to discuss George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel, with his spirals of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. History, to him, isn't a straight line. It's a dance of contradictions resolving themselves through time. Sophie is fascinated. So reality unfolds like a great idea, correcting itself. Alberto smiles, and perhaps we're part of that correction. Sophie starts to dream bigger, not of escaping, but of remaking. Could they influence their world, not with rebellion, but with philosophy itself? She begins to write in a notebook she finds inexplicably in her pocket. What she writes isn't always readable, even to her, but she feels that the act of writing itself is generative. That thoughts made visible might anchor them more solidly into being. Meanwhile, Hilda, our parallel soul, our reader become co-author, is making plans. Inspired by Sophie's resilience, she begins to challenge her father not with argument, but with philosophy. She leaves notes in his coat pockets. Is omniscience ethical? Does creation demand responsibility? Are fictional lives lesser? She's weaponizing questions. Lovingly. And Albert Nag begins to feel it. The God author is being questioned by his own child and by his own creations. He starts to write less, reflect more. He walks through his garden and touches a flower as if for the first time. He rereads the story he's written, and for the first time, he doesn't recognize every sentence. Some lines surprise him. Some feel foreign, alive. Back in the story world, Sophie and Alberto meet other characters, blurred, shimmering, incomplete. Gaarder does not name them. They feel like sketches abandoned mid-chapter, half-formed ideas. They speak in fragments, like forgotten memories, and hint that there are other stories trying to awaken. Sophie listens to them with reverence. "Do you want to be written?" she asks one. The response is chillingly beautiful. "No, I want to be real." This is the emotional height of the novel's metaphysical inquiry, the yearning not just for freedom, but for substance, for reality that isn't conditional, for selfhood that doesn't depend on someone else's pen. Gaarder, of course, is laying bare the philosophical question of existential authenticity. What does it mean to be truly? Heidegger would argue that authenticity lies in embracing our temporality, our finitude. But Sophie and Alberto, untethered from time, face a different question. Can fictional beings have authentic existence? They stumble into a church, or something like it. Gaarder never fully clarifies. It's quiet, camellit dust thick. On the walls are murals, not of saints, but of philosophers. Spinoza with his serene stare, Kant holding a tiny scale, Sartre looking lost. In the center is a mirror, and Sophie walks up to it, expecting to see herself. Instead, she sees Hilda, and in Hilda's eyes, she sees herself again. They are linked now, not just by narrative, but by awareness. They are reading each other, creating each other. Sophie lifts her hand, and in the mirror, Hilda lifts hers. But when Sophie waves, Hilda doesn't mimic it. She waves back, independently, intentionally. It's a small moment, but it breaks everything open. Sophie turns to Alberto, her voice hushed. "She sees me." Alberto exhales like he's just heard the final note of a lifelong symphony. Then perhaps, he says, "We've already won." From that point forward, the pace slows. The story becomes less about where they go or what they do, and more about being. They don't run anymore. They sit, think, watch birds pass overhead. They don't flee their narrative because now they're shaping it. They discuss the rise of existentialism. Alberto speaks of Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Nietzsche. Each thinker represents a deeper plunge into the self, a call to authenticity, even despair. Sophie listens, taking notes, not because she needs to remember, but because writing is now her way of being real. She begins to compose her own philosophy, not to replace the greats, but to stand beside them. Her thoughts are tentative, filled with questions, but they are hers. Outside the book, Hilda begins to feel the pressure of impending loss. She knows that Sophie cannot stay forever, that stories end, that even imagined beings, no matter how alive they feel, are shadows of narrative. But she doesn't despair. Instead, she writes one final letter to Sophie, a love letter, a philosophical benediction. She places it in the back of her father's manuscript and whispers, "This is for you." We don't see Sophie receive it. We don't need to, because what matters is that it was written. And in a world shaped by thought, writing is reality. The boundaries between author and character, reader and story, begin to dissolve like fog under morning sun. The story becomes less a linear tale and more a meditation. Sophie and Alberto, existing now in that liminal space between fiction and thought, have stopped searching for a way out. Instead, they explore the terrain of awareness itself. Sophie has begun to feel time differently, not as a series of ticking clocks, but as something fluid. She stands on the edge of a lake and watches ripples dance across the water, thinking of Heraclitus. No man ever steps in the same river twice. Only now does she realize she is both the river and the one stepping in. Alberto speaks of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. If you had to live this life over and over, exactly the same, would you embrace it or despair? Sophie doesn't answer, but her silence is thoughtful, maybe even peaceful. The pair begins to create rituals. Morning walks through the fields of their mind world. Philosophical dialogues by candlelight. They're no longer trying to defy the narrative. They are inhabiting it with full awareness. There's a sacredness in that shift, a soft, glowing reverence for the now. Meanwhile, Hilda is undergoing her own transformation. At first, Sophie had been a game, an idea to surprise her father. But now, Sophie feels real. Her choices feel independent. Hilda rereads earlier parts of the book and notices moments she thought her father wrote that don't feel like him anymore. She begins to wonder, is Sophie still his creation? She starts to study philosophy with more urgency. She highlights Kant's distinction between the noumenal and phenomenal world. She wonders if Sophie exists in some kind of noumenal layer, a being in a world beyond experience, now brushing up against the boundaries of perception. What if fictional consciousness is just another kind of noumenon? Late one night, Hilda dreams of Sophie, not as a character, but as a presence, vivid, silent, standing by the edge of her bed with a candle in her hands. Hilda whispers, "Are you free?" Sophie doesn't answer, but her smile is filled with light. Back in Sophie's world, a new shift occurs. The story begins to fragment. Pages thin, light bleeds through the edges, and certain places stop behaving logically. Sophie and Alberto walk into a forest that loops endlessly. They pass the same tree again and again, until they stop walking entirely and sit at its roots. "Perhaps this is it," Alberto says softly. "Not escape, not rebellion, but acceptance." Sophie tilts her head. "You mean choose to be here?" Yes, to be fully in it, even if it's not ours, even if it ends. The moment is slow, suspended. They talk of Sartre, how existence precedes essence. That maybe Sophie wasn't created to be anyone. Maybe she becomes who she is by the choices she makes. Even in a world not her own, even as a character on borrowed pages, she has agency. It's quiet, humble agency, but profound. Hilda, reading this, begins to weep. It's not sadness. It's awe. Her heart aches the way it does when you realize something is too beautiful to keep. And then it happens. Albert Nag finishes the manuscript. The book closes. The story officially is done. But Gaarder refuses to end it there. Sophie and Alberto aren't erased. Instead, they slip into the margins, into the folds of the narrative. They exist not on the page, but in the space between the reader and the story. They become philosophical echoes, always there if you know where to listen. The final chapters blur fiction and philosophy more than ever. Gaarder uses Sophie's ending as a way to invite the reader into their own philosophical awakening. He shows us the seams of storytelling, not to ruin the illusion, but to remind us that all life is storytelling. All identity, all memory, all belief, narratives we live by. Hilda writes her own version of Sophie's story, this time not as a gift for her father, but as a gift for herself. It's quieter, gentler. She writes about a girl walking through a garden of questions, each petal a different philosophy. The girl doesn't escape the garden. She learns to love it, to tend it. This final act is not a grand resolution. There's no climax, no battle, just a soft landing into awareness. Sophie, wherever she is, book, dream, thought, has become something more. Not just a character, not just a student of philosophy. She's an invitation, a mirror, a seed. She shows us what it means to awaken, not by escaping your world, but by learning to see it as it is and still love it. She reminds us that philosophy isn't a school subject. It's not dusty books or dead thinkers. It's how you greet the morning, how you sit with your thoughts, how you choose to be kind, even when no one is watching. And as the story fades into silence, the echo of Sophie's journey remains, not a loud trumpet, but a whisper you carry. The voice that asks when everything else quiets down, "Who are you, really?" In the final pages, the story folds inward like a closing flower. But some flowers bloom in the dark. With the story's conclusion still lingering in the air, it's time to shift our gaze. Let's step back from the trees and look at the whole forest. Not the twists and turns of Sophie's footsteps, but the soil beneath them, the philosophical heart of Sophie's world itself. At its core, Sophie's world is not about answers. It's about awakening, a gentle nudge to help you realize you've been asleep, dreaming through the daily, the ordinary, the automatic. And suddenly, someone whispers, "Why? Why are we here? Why do we think what we think? Why does a flower blooming feel so different than a light turning on? Why do we chase things? Why do we feel?" The book doesn't give you a doctrine. It walks you, hand in hand, through the history of philosophy, not to convert you, but to free you. to show you that all thought is a mosaic of voices, and that your own voice matters just as much. We begin in ancient Greece with Thales and Heraclitus, men who wondered if everything was water or fire, not because they were silly, but because they dared to look at the world as if for the first time. Their questions may seem quaint now, but their bravery to question what everyone else accepted is still radical today. Then comes Plato, with his perfect forms and shadowed caves. His ideas give us language for the things we feel, but can't always explain. The sense that there's something more real than reality. Something beautiful that lives just outside the corner of our eye. Aristotle grounds us, pulls us into the particulars. No lofty clouds, just logic and classification. He teaches us how to look at things closely and find order. And even that is a kind of poetry. The Stoics arrive with their calm, their resilience. They remind us that the only true freedom lies in how we respond to the world, not in how we try to control it. And the Epicureans gently whisper, "Don't fear death. Fear not having lived." Later, Descartes asks us to doubt everything, even our own existence. He strips away the world until all that remains is "I think." And in that, he gives us a lonely but powerful truth. Consciousness is the beginning of everything. Kant turns our attention to the limits of knowing. He tells us that we are always wearing tinted glasses, that we never see the world as it is, only as it appears to us. It's humbling, but also liberating. If perception shapes reality, maybe we have more power than we think. Then the existentialists, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, they don't offer comforting answers. They hand us mirrors. What will you do, they ask, knowing life has no inherent meaning? Will you despair, or will you create meaning? Sophie walks this path with us. She reads, she reacts, she resists. Sometimes she's confused, sometimes overwhelmed. But that's what makes her real. That's what makes her us. She's not a prodigy or a guru. She's a teenage girl with a mailbox full of questions. And that's the quiet genius of the book. It doesn't pretend philosophy is only for professors or monks. It says, no, this is for you, right now, in your messy room, with your doubts and your hopes and your half-finished coffee. You're already a philosopher. You just forgot. As the story unfolds, the metaphysical twist, learning she's a character in a book, only deepens the theme. Because aren't we all characters in stories? Narratives told by family, by culture, by our past. Roles we didn't choose, but still perform? Sophie fights against that. Not with violence, but with questions, with awareness. She doesn't want to escape the story. She wants to see it clearly, to move through it awake. And that's the ultimate message. Awakening doesn't mean becoming someone else. It means becoming yourself. Not the version your parents wrote. Not the version your society printed. But the one you feel flickering quietly inside. The one who stands under the stars and feels small but infinite. The one who cries at beauty. The one who wonders why. That's why Sophie's world belongs in level 1, awakening the senses. Because it doesn't just give you facts, it gives you eyes. It helps you see the world again, like a child, but with the depth of an old soul. The writing itself reflects this duality. It's simple on the surface, accessible, even playful. But beneath the simplicity lies an intricate dance of structure and symbolism. The use of letters, the layering of narrative levels, the choice to use a young girl as the seeker, all intentional, all precise. Gaarder wrote this book not just to teach philosophy, but to embody it, to show that philosophy is not abstract. It is intimate. It is the heartbeat of life. It is in every breath you take when you're truly present. And in Sophie, we see that breath made real. She's not a saint. She's not perfect, but she's brave. She questions. She listens. She feels. And that maybe is enough. As the section closes, we carry a quiet understanding. The point was never to find all the answers. It was to remember that the questions are beautiful. As we reach the penultimate step in Sophie's journey, and ours, it's time to sink even deeper. Not in a more philosophy per se, but in a how this book asks us to live with the weight of all we've learned. Because let's be honest, knowledge can be heavy. Once you've opened your mind to the idea that everything is fluid, morality, identity, the nature of existence, it's tempting to want to shut it again. To go back to the cozy illusions. To say, thanks, that was enlightening, and slide quietly back into autopilot. But Sophie's world doesn't let us. Instead, it ends by pushing us gently, almost playfully, into one last confrontation with ourselves. In the final movements of the book, the boundary between fiction and reality dissolves completely. Sophie and Alberto don't just discover their characters in someone's story. They try to escape it. They hijack their own narrative. On paper, it's absurd. A teenage girl and her philosopher friend plotting to break free from a mind of a fictional author. But in truth, it's breathtakingly honest. Because how many of us have tried to rewrite our roles? How many of us have paused midlife and asked, whose story is this, really? We are born into scripts, gender scripts, cultural scripts, religious scripts, family expectations, societal timelines, and often we follow them because it's easier than noticing we're on a stage. The moment we do notice, when the spotlight hits us and we feel the invisible strings, that's the moment Sophie experiences. That's the moment the book gifts us. But escaping the script isn't about running away. It's about seeing what is real and what is imposed, seeing that we can choose differently. It's no accident that Sophie doesn't win with violence or cleverness or magic. She wins with awareness. She becomes real the moment she knows she's not. And that paradox, awareness giving birth to authenticity, is the most human truth of all. Now, let's talk about the philosophical implications of that. Gaarder could have ended this book at the history of thought. He could have wrapped up with Sartre or Camus and called it a day. But he goes one step further. He turns the philosophical lens onto philosophy itself. Is it just a game of ideas? Is it just mental gymnastics? Or is it a living, breathing act of resistance? A way to fight against numbness, conformity, forgetting? Sophie's journey says, philosophy is a survival skill. It's how you stay awake in a world that wants you sedated by screens, routines, and prepackaged beliefs. It's how you remain alive when everything around you is designed to keep you just comfortable enough to never question anything. And in that sense, this book is a rebellion. A soft, tender, beautifully subversive rebellion. Not against authority, but against forgetting. Against becoming a ghost in your own life. Even the way Gaarder uses children as philosophers, Sophie, Hilda, taps into a deeper truth. The wisest part of us is the part that hasn't been tamed yet. The part that still marvels, still asks why without embarrassment. And it's not just philosophical depth that makes this book a masterpiece. It's how he delivers it. The structure of Sophie's world is deceptively simple. A girl, a mentor, a mystery, but layered within are mirrors inside mirrors. Letters turn into voices. Voices turn into stories. Stories turn into lives. You're never quite sure who's narrating or why. And that confusion, that's intentional. That's the point. Because in real life, we don't get clean arcs and satisfying resolutions. We get overlapping narratives, competing truths, incomplete understandings. And the book prepares us for that. It trains our minds to be comfortable in the murky, the maybe, the mystery. That's why Sophie's world belongs not just on shelves, but in hearts. It's a guidebook to being awake, not just intellectually, but emotionally, spiritually, viscerally. And so, what do we really gain by the end? We've met the greatest thinkers in history. We've watched a fictional girl break the fourth wall and question her existence. We've wandered through abstract theories and concrete emotions. And now, we're left with a final, haunting invitation to live philosophically. That doesn't mean quoting Plato at parties. It means being present, curious, ethical. It means noticing when you're sleepwalking and choosing again and again to wake up. And maybe that's what being human is. Not a state, but a choice. Not a fixed identity, but a process, a becoming, a returning. Like Sophie, we are all students of the world. And the world, if we listen, is always whispering its riddles. So tonight, as you fall asleep, maybe you'll hear one. Maybe the stars overhead will ask, "Who are you, really?" And maybe, just maybe you'll smile, because now you know how to start answering. As we glide into the final act of Sophie's story, and ours, it's not so much a conclusion as it is a widening, an opening out, like the very sky stretching, silent and eternal, over the heads of two curious souls wandering beyond the margins of their own narrative. The book has peeled back so many layers. Philosophy, history, identity, reality. And now we are left with a different kind of question. No longer what is truth or what is real, but rather, what will I do with all this? In the final pages of Sophie's world, Sophie and Alberto succeed, in a sense, at breaking out. They leave the author's constructed world behind, slipping ghost-like into the realm of imagination, a place where time and space no longer hold sway, where characters live on independent of the will that birthed them. And here's the beautiful paradox. They become most alive when they escape the boundaries of what the book calls reality. In letting go of the rigid structure imposed on them, they step into freedom, not bound by narrative logic, not confined to causality or chronology. It's a metaphor so rich it glows. Because aren't we all hoping for that? A life not dictated by scripts handed down through culture, family, habit. This is where Sophie's world transforms from a book about philosophy into an act of philosophy itself. It doesn't just explain ideas, it enacts them. It demonstrates that thought, when truly embodied, can liberate. That stories, when truly questioned, can open doorways. That asking, "Who am I?" over and over might not give us a fixed answer, but it will carve out space for truth to walk in. And that's exactly what Gaarder does here. He invites us into the space beyond narrative, beyond certainty, beyond even Sophie. And so we drift gently into the review. Let's start where the book itself does, with the wonder of a child. Sophie is the perfect protagonist, not because she's extraordinary, but because she is still becoming. She isn't jaded, isn't trapped by ego or expectation. She's open, and that openness is the true genius of the novel. Through her eyes, we relearn how to wonder, to look at a spoon and ask why it exists, to see a tree and feel awe instead of walking past it on autopilot. The early chapters lull us into this innocent questioning, echoing Plato's cave, shadows on the wall. Yes, but also the courage to turn toward the light. Gaarder's structure is deceptively brilliant. A dual story. The mystery of the letters and Hilda's father's experiment, nested inside the history of philosophy. It could have been a mess. It could have been dry. But instead, it's seamless. The fictional frame enhances the learning because it gives it stakes. Sophie's curiosity is our curiosity. Her revelations become our awakenings. And then there's the mirror play, where the author within the book controls Sophie, just as Gaarder controls him. The metafictional layers aren't gimmicks. They're lessons in epistemology. How do we know what's real? Who is pulling the strings? And what happens when we notice the strings exist? Few novels manage this level of philosophical engagement without becoming alienating. But Sophie's world remains deeply human. It weaves in the tangible. Sophie's room, her mother's confusion, her cat, the postcards. It reminds us that thinking doesn't have to be abstract. That wisdom starts in the everyday, in socks, in birthdays, in the shape of a cloud. And then there's Hilda. Her role is subtle but vital. She's the reader within the story, mirroring us. As she begins to see her father's creation as cruel, manipulative, even godlike, we begin to question the nature of authorship, authority, and even parenthood. Is control love? Is storytelling ethical? And just when those questions become too big, the book does something astonishing. It lets go. It ends with a whisper, not an answer, not a summary, but a continuation, a flicker of movement in the invisible realm, a question posed to the wind. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of Sophie's world. Philosophy is not about mastering content. It's about cultivating presence, being alive to the moment, being brave enough to not have all the answers, being kind enough to keep asking anyway. In that way, this novel earns its place in playlist level 1 awakening the senses. Because before you can become anything wise, virtuous, free, you must first feel. You must notice. You must wake up to the miracle of being here. This isn't a book to be read once. It's a book that lingers, that echoes, that waits patiently on your shelf until the next moment of wonder calls you back. So, tonight, as the lights dim and the soft hum of your fan sets the rhythm for rest, let Sophie's world continue its quiet work in you. Let the images drift across your closed eyelids, an envelope in a mailbox, a philosopher in the woods, a girl, wide-eyed, peering into the stars. And let your mind loosen, not empty, but soften, like warm clay, like waves against the shore. The questions will come again tomorrow. And now, dear thinker, dear dreamer, it's time to rest. Sweet dreams.